What's up, guys? It's been a real long time since I made a video, so I owe you an apology. So many of you subscribed to the channel and sent me questions and comments, so I'm really appreciative for all that. And I apologize for not making a video for so long. Um, just been very busy with things. I was going through my last year of law school. I've graduated, passed the bar exam, started working, so I'm not sure how often I'm going to be able to make videos anymore, but I wanted to give you a few and, get some more information out there. I'm still happy to offer, as much advice as I can. And, I've been active in answering comments and responding to messages that you guys sent to me. So, hopefully I haven't left you guys hanging too bad. But I figured I would, get back to it. Today, I wanted to hit on a topic that I essentially said a long time ago I wouldn't cover, and that's the LSAT or the LSAT. And you know, somebody could spend an entire, could spend years giving advice about the LSAT, making an entire LSAT channel, and still not go through all the information. And obviously, this isn't an LSAT channel; it's more just a general law school advice channel. But since so many of you asked questions, and since I did used to be an LSAT tutor, I figured I would give you at least my top tips for the test. And what I was going to do is give you essentially the top 3 tips I could think of for all the individual sections of the test, and then just some general advice for the LSAT and things you could use to do better on the test. Now, just by way of general information, the LSAT or LSAT is broken down into 3 sections, 3 different types of sections. When you're actually taking the test, there's 5 sections, individual sections, but I'll discuss that in a second. The types of sections. So you have what's called logical reasoning, and that involves discrete arguments. So they give you a paragraph of information, usually an argument or a set of facts, and they ask you to do something with it. They might say something like, which of the following answer choices would strengthen the argument, or what is an assumption underlying the argument, or what is a flaw in the reasoning of the argument. So that's the logical reasoning section. You get 2 logical reasoning sections in the actual test, or at least 2 that are counted. You have 1 section of what's called logic games, and these are almost like puzzles, or it's sort of like math without numbers. And there are many kinds of logic games, logic puzzles that you can have on this test. There are ones that involve more of a linear aspect, in which it'll say A sits 2 seats away from C, and B can never sit next to E, and they ask for what orders they could possibly sit in. Or you have games that have more of a grouping aspect, and they say, there's 2 cars that are taking a drive together, and they say, A can never be in the same car as B, or C, and if D is in car 1, E is in car 2. So sort of there's no linear or ordering aspect to it, but there's a grouping aspect to it. And then the 3rd section that there's only one of is reading comprehension, and that gives you very long extended passages, and then ask you a few questions based on that particular passage. And that's your sort of standard thing. You've seen it all the way back to the SAT. Now, those sections add up to 4. So there's 2 logical reasoning, 1 logic game, 1 reading comprehension. That adds up to 4 sections that are actually counted and graded for purposes of the test. There's 5 sections total because you get 1 experimental section, and it could be any of those 3 types, but it is not counted toward your overall score. So you won't know when you're taking it which is the experimental section necessarily. At least at the time you're taking it, you won't know which is experimental. But when you take the test, it's 5 sections, but only 4 actually count. So let me start with the general tips that I give people. And these are sort of global pieces of advice that you can apply to any section on the test. The big one that I really focus on with people is that in any given question on the LSAT, there's always 5 answer choices. Only 1 is right and 4 are wrong. Now, that seems intuitive. Of course, there's only 1 right answer. But people get in this mindset of thinking of answer choices as maybe being, looking at one and saying, oh, that's a good answer, and then looking at another choice and saying, oh, that's the better answer. So, okay, this one's good. It's pretty much right, but this one's even better, so I'll pick that one. That's not a good mindset on this test, because this is a test of logic. And if any answer choice is wrong for even the slightest reason, it's 100% wrong. To say something is 99% right is essentially to say it's 100% wrong. Because unless it's bulletproof, 100%, it is not the right answer. So you need to think from a perspective of not, working from the ground up and trying to prove answers right and trying to justify answers and say, oh, it's good, let try and justify it and think of sort of tell yourself why you want to pick the answer. You should be doing the opposite. You should be a complete cynic, so thinking backwards, trying to chop apart every single answer and trying to punch holes in it. I tell people, you look at a right answer and you can't look at it and tell me why it's right. The only reason that the right answer is right is because it's not wrong. Again, it sounds silly, but the only reason the right answer is right is because it has no logical flaw. It is bulletproof. Now, the incorrect answers, you can actually look at it and point to a reason why it's wrong. You could say, that word shouldn't be there. That word, extends the scope of the argument too far. Or that does not, that should, that, it doesn't apply in 100% of situations, just most of the time, whereas it needs to apply all the time. So think from that perspective. Always be trying to disprove answers. So say you reach 2 answer choices on a question. You've knocked off 3 and you have 2 left. You're not looking for the right answer. You're looking for the wrong answer. You're trying to find the flaw. Because again, you can't look at the right answer and say, oh, that one is right. Whereas you can look at the wrong answer and say, this one is wrong for this reason. And if you can clearly state why a wrong answer is wrong, you're gold. Those are the people who are going to do the best on the test. The ones who don't just pick the right answer, but realize why they did not pick the wrong answers. So it's so important when you review the test, analyze your answer choices, and analyze all the wrong ones so you can go through and see how they tried to trick you and how they can fool you. So that's the first general piece of advice. Second is that the best practice you can do on the LSAT is to take real practice questions. So yes, you want to do some supplementary things in which say you have books that don't have real questions or books that give you general advice on the test. Those are great, but there's no substitute for doing real questions. So you want to pick up the books from what's called the Law School Admissions Council, or LSAC. They release books of real tests. You can buy all the actual released tests from them. Buy them. Buy as many as you can. Take as many as you can. And that's the best practice you're going to get, because you're going to see the real trends and habits of the actual questions themselves. And it doesn't change that much over time. You start seeing the trends, and you start seeing the patterns, and you get used to the language that they use. So no substitute for real questions. I say time yourself, because timing is very important. There are many students that I had who would, they'd be great if you gave them all the time in the world to analyze the questions, and it would give them a false sense of confidence, because once we would turn on the clock and actually score their tests, you'd see their scores would go down a lot, because it was really the timing that was being a hindrance, whereas they actually understood the material, but they just weren't fast at it yet. Now, of course, accuracy comes before time. You need to know how to get the question. You have to get the questions right and actually understand what you're doing before you do it quickly. So yes, accuracy before time, but don't completely push aside the timing aspect to it, because you don't want to get, within the last month of the test, having never taken a real-time section to see what, how your pacing would actually go. So those are the 3 general pieces of advice that I give for the test. Always, the most important thing. Think from, try and disprove answers. 1 right, 4 completely wrong. The best practice is real questions, and focus on timing, because it's very important. It's an aspect to it that people sometimes push aside because they spend so much time focusing on accuracy. And again, accuracy is important, but timing is also very important. So now I'm going to give you 3 basic pieces of advice for the 3 individual sections. Some of this advice has crossover to other sections. You'll see where it sort of bleeds from one to the next. Let's start with logical reasoning, because that is obviously 50% of the test, 2 sections. Number 1 is, again, it's a block of text, each question, and it's almost always an argument. What is an argument? It is a conclusion that is supported by premises. So you have to always isolate the conclusion. So number 1, isolate the conclusion. Figure out what the conclusion is. You need to be able to point to the sentence, or at least paraphrase in your own mind, because it's not always clear in the text. What is the conclusion? If you don't know what the conclusion is, and how it separates out from the premises, you're going to have a very hard time, because they might say, which one of the following, if we added it into the argument, would strengthen the conclusion? If you don't know what the conclusion is, how would you know how to strengthen the conclusion? Or let's say they give you a logical flaw question, and the conclusion, say, isn't really supported by the premises. Again, if you don't see which is the conclusion, how would you know what their error is in reaching that conclusion? So learn how to isolate that conclusion. That can be done, sometimes in easier questions by looking at keywords. They might say therefore or as a result, or you see keywords that sort of hone you in on the conclusion. Other times it's not so clear. So you really have to practice on picking out what the conclusion is. 2 is read all the answer choices very carefully, because they build the test in a way that tricks you on very subtle things. It might be a word that's the answer choice might be completely right except for the word some versus most, or all versus many. These little quantifiers, or these little things, completely change the answer choices. So don't get suckered into an answer choice and then just stop reading. It's not like the logic games where it's so clear that an answer is right, whereas the other ones are wrong. Because again, logic games are like math. Logical reasoning is very much not. It's abstract with the wording. It can be very confusing. Read all the answer choices. Oftentimes, I've seen that the trick answer is usually right before the real answer. So they make it that way so that you see the trick answer, you say, oh, of course that's right. You pick it, you just go on. And then you never got to the real answer choice. Maybe you would have seen it if you kept reading. You see that pretty often on the test. The trick answer is right before the real one. So that really stresses the importance of top to bottom. Read every answer choice. Number 3 is, let's see. It really just goes right back to that general tip I gave before, that if you get to 2 answer choices, try and find the wrong answer. So lots of times you'll be able to knock off 3, because there are 3 that, there's usually 1 that's clearly wrong, 2 are that are pretty bad, and you can safely say that they're wrong. But a lot of times you reach 2 answer choices and you just don't know which one is right. So again, I know I already said this, but I can't stress it enough. Find the wrong answer. Try to disprove both of those answer choices. And the right answer is right because you weren't able to prove it wrong, whereas the other one you were able to prove wrong for some small reason. Again, 99% right is 100% wrong. It's right or it's wrong 100% of the time. So those are the 3 tips for logical reasoning. Let's do logic games. Again, sort of like math puzzles, but without any numbers. It's very important that you diagram all the rules at the beginning of the game. They'll give you a series of rules, and you can diagram it out in a visual sense. So say it's a linear ordering game. You want to actually set it up on your paper so that you could see all the rules. I essentially make my rules bullet points. I say, okay, bullet point 1, 2, and 3. I write the rules out, and then I make a diagram. Again, if it's ordering, it's just lines going across. If it's grouping, usually I make a little T chart to show the separating out the groups 1 from 2. Maybe if there's 3 groups, make it a extended T chart. But I'm a very visual person. I need to diagram it out. I need to see those rules so that I always keep track of them. And then also make inferences. This is still part of 1, but the inferences sort of factor into the diagram. Say you manipulate these rules and you realize how they work together. And say by looking at the rules you realize, oh, factor A can never go in group 3 because you've realized something because of the way 2 rules sort of interplay with one another. So you would note that somewhere in your diagram, these inferences that you make. And so if you spend some time at the beginning of the game sketching it out and understanding, well, what are my factors? What is the base that I'm working with? Is a linear game? Is this a grouping game? How is it set up? What are the inferences I can make? These games are won and lost at the very beginning. If you can make a solid diagram with all your inferences, you made your rules very clear, the whole game is going to become a lot easier. Whereas if you just try and wing it question by question, you're going to spend so much more time. If you have a good diagram, the questions often become real easy. Sometimes you'll even know the answer before you even look at the choices because the question is asking about an inference you've already made. So spend some time at the beginning, working on that diagram, making those inferences, because that little bit of extra time investment will save you time later in the test. And number 2 is to use your hypotheticals and your past work to your advantage. So what I mean by that is, let's say they say which of the following orders is an acceptable order of the people in the rows. Say that's person 1 through 6. And let's say you pick answer choice A. You say this order is an acceptable order of the 6 people, the one that fits the rules. Well, what you want to do is circle that and make note of it, because let's say later they say, tell me, they ask who can never go in spot one. You look back at that first question and you know that, so let's say A is in spot one. You know A is not the answer to that later question, because you say, well, A can go in spot one. So it can't possibly be the case that A could never go in spot one, because I have right here A actually in spot one. Anytime you make a hypothetical, let's say they're asking you what could be true, and you diagram out a little hypothetical, order that is of course in line with all the rules. You want to sketch it out and you want to see it, and you want to actually make note of it so you can use it to your advantage later. So always circle and put some kind of like star or check next to your good hypos, but always cross out the ones that don't work. And the third piece of advice is to be very clear with what kind of question you're working with. Is it a must be true, must be false, could be true, could be false? Circle those words and just keep saying it out loud so you don't get mixed up, because it gets very confusing, because they might have the word except in there also. They say each of the following must be true except. You need to phrase that in your own words and keep track of what you're actually looking for. Last is reading comprehension. And again, this is more basic because you've done reading comprehension in the past. I would say read the passage just one time. So read it slow enough that you only have to read it one time, because reading it one time slowly is better than reading it 2 times quickly, when it doesn't matter how many times you read it. If you're doing it too fast, you're not going to remember it. Point 2 is to summarize each paragraph. By that I mean, think of each paragraph as just a little discrete chunk in the overall story. Summarize each paragraph into essentially one sentence. And what I do is usually I'll make a little note on the margin of what the paragraph was about. And then I could read those little margin notes going from top to bottom, and I know the entire structure of the piece I just read. And point 3 is to really get inside the author's head. And by that I mean, isolate the pieces in the essay that represent what the author thinks, as opposed to what other people think. They'll often say things like, some people believe that abstract art is so and so, but it's actually so separate out what some people believe from what he actually believes. When you see words that highlight his points of view, he might say it's extremely important that we do so and so. Circle those kinds of keywords so you get in his head, because you'll have many questions that will say, the author would think would think what of the following sentence, or what does the author think about this? So really get inside the author's head and mark up the passage in a way that will allow you to separate out the author's view from other people's views. That's my basic LSAT advice. Again, if you have any particular LSAT questions, just let me know. Again, it's not an LSAT advice channel, but I'm happy to give whatever advice I can to you guys. Again, sorry for how long it's been since the last video, and I'll try and make another one not too long. Again, it definitely won't be a year. I promise that. It'll actually be a lot sooner. Take care, guys. I'll see you soon.